I think that we should be quicker to look within ourselves and notice our own fallenness and brokenness than to identify another person as the other or outside my camp of people. And so just the way it's used with just bolstering tribal identities can often be divisive. And I think that as Christians, we're called to a kind of love and charity that shouldn't be quick to have tribal alignments. And labeling others as woke, I think, is often used to that effect.
So there's a very popular thing going on in culture right now. It's being talked about by all kinds of people, and it's particularly pertinent because we're recording this in the early months of 2025. It's very much in the political scene, and that is this whole concept of woke or wokeness. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And so today I'm joined by Jaron. He helped me start Anabaptist Perspectives a number of years ago, and Marlon, who's the current director of Anabaptist Perspectives. And let's just open up with, why are we talking about the concept of wokeness? Jaron, why don't you kick us off?
Like you said, many people are talking about it now. It's a very live conversation in the culture, and it's something that has reached Anabaptist Perspectives through some of the feedback that we've gotten from audience members.
You engage with the audience feedback a fair bit, don't you?
Yes. Yep. Emails, Facebook comments, Telegram messages, YouTube comments, all that comes to me.
So I figure it would be pertinent, just so people understand a bit of the context of what we're talking about. I'm going to actually read some of these comments.
Good.
Often these come on YouTube and things like that. So here's one. We did an episode a while ago called "We Must Make Schools Work for All Children." And there's this bit of a long comment here. And the person says, that's because we recognize that education is simply discipleship of one's worldview as it applies to different areas of life. We're discipling little image bearers of God to think biblically about maths and science and history and art. We don't have to drag in Marxist DEI categories, which are antithetical to God's law, in order to do so, which is what Coons, and it was Ruth Anna Coons who did that episode, seems to think that we need to do. This is clear evidence that Liberty University has gone woke.
She was a student at Liberty.
Okay. I was wondering if there was context for that.
That's where she graduated
from. Perhaps Kuhn doesn't realize that she's imbibed aspects of their ideology as it pertains to education, but she's actually acting as a water carrier for them and unwittingly helping them to advance their Antichrist revolution. So pretty strong feelings coming from there. Here was another one on trauma-informed churches. That was one you did with Janelle Glick. This person said, one of the major red flags with the trauma movement is that it enables perpetual victimhood status. People never rise above whatever happened or did not happen to them. They spend the rest of their life wanting a handkerchief and a hand on the shoulder. This is simply not the way to help people. And there's a bunch more. A short snippet. Someone says on another one, please reject woke nonsense. So we get this kind of stuff. This is just a slice. There's a bunch more of these. If people want to go comb through the comments, you'll find more. So that's a bit of the context. And one of the things we like to do with the podcast is to engage with the feedback we get from listeners. So why don't we start with just a brief history of the term woke? Like, what are we even talking about when that term is used? It is used so much in so many different contexts, it's pretty easy to lose track of. So yeah, do you have anything on that?
Can we divert that to Marlon?
Marlon, would you?
Yeah, I can't give a full history, but even just a little bit of what I've seen in my own lifetime and how I've seen that meaning shift. I understand the term goes back before my lifetime, used by Africans, I think both African American and still from the continent of Africa, to simply to refer to the idea of, being awake, and particular being awake or aware of difficulties they faced or oppression or whatever. It obviously has come forward, got generalized. I remember, 10 years ago or something like that. Woke is a little bit more general term, just of, somebody who's aware of things, aware of social dynamics, and maybe some of that was anti-Christian stuff, but it was also just like, if you're a man and you're aware of cultural dynamics and what the cultural expectations are on women, and that whether it's double standards in regard to sexual morality or how you look at dividing up housework if both husband and wife are working or whatever. So it's generally people using it approvingly, and in ways that I don't know what I think about all of them, but relatively innocuous. And then I think a little later, I remember it being kind of used to indicate, I don't know, a kind of insincerity or something like, somebody considers themselves woke because they can talk about how this is that as a problem, but, they're not really engaged in it with real life. They're drinking their lattes and making statements about something. And so in that sense, it was a little pejorative in the sense of, insincere or not really having skin in the game, but wanting to make statements about something. And then, lip service. But yeah, more recently, Wikipedia, thanks, Jaron, for pointing out the Wikipedia article. Wikipedia says something like 2019. I can't say exact dates.
2019.
Where the real shift to woke coming from people on the right and using that as a way of insulting what they're considering as left generally. Again, with some of the same tones about same ideas of, I think, insincere protest and so on. But it seems like recently it has generalized to become kind of a catch-all for, kind of anything that's perceived as potentially on the left side of the political spectrum or something. I don't know.
And typically used by the right.
Used by the right as derogatory.
Is there any other functional definitions at this point where people would wish to use woke as a description for their own approach, or is it only pejorative at this point?
Seems to me the pejorative is dominant, but the idea of it as positive, like we are awake, we are aware of what's going on. I mean, that was certainly claimed as a positive term not very long ago.
So I think some still would probably. Yeah. View it.
And I mean, who wants to be asleep?
Yeah, that's a great. I guess I've never thought about this quite like that. But
yeah, it's awake, aware, as opposed to in your dull slumbers not realizing what's going on. I mean, that's the original idea.
But then thinking in terms of woke, I don't know if I've ever heard it except in the context of someone who would claim I'm not woke and I'm calling something else woke, and it's used as a kind of insult.
So that brought
or calling
it to much more
out.
into the mainstream. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, which I think we were having a conversation at some point a few years ago. We were talking about the engagement we have with our audience on the podcast. And it seemed like 2019 or the COVID era, I guess you could say, the comments started tended to be more nasty or hostile. Do you remember this? It does seem like we've had more of the, this is whatever woke or whatever buzzword. Seems like that's hitting the comments more now than it would have 7 years ago, say.
It definitely intensified quite a bit over that time.
Now that's interesting. Is there anything more either of you all want to add as far as context, definitions, etc. on this?
I mean, just to honor, there's a complex history to the term, and I think what we're going to be talking about now is mostly kind of responding to how it's used as a term of insult or a term of insult or kind of a large negative characterization. Most people are using the most dominant use of it now seems to be as seeing it as a bad thing, using it to criticize, and that's primarily what we're going to be responding to here.
Yeah, and let's get into that where some people use this as a way of criticizing and just labeling people or things. Let's engage with that. What are some things we want to add to that conversation, ways perhaps we want to respond, especially because, it does seem in more recent years that has started popping up in the comments more. And I'm sure those people who made those comments will be like, well, that's because your podcast has shifted and it's become more woke and blah, 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 whatever. I know I've heard that from a few comments here and there. It's interesting. I'd be curious what you'd have to say about that, Jaron.
This is more about the way the term is used than the substance behind what the term may actually mean. That there's definitely a conversation there. But in general, I am sad about the way I often hear the term being used for a few reasons. One of which is that it's often quite sloppy in the way that it's applied. There are a variety of different issues that it could legitimately be in reference to, some of which Marlon referred to. But when it's just used generally as a catch-all for a particular approach to issues that we find disagreeable, I think it's quite sloppy and not helpful for constructive dialogue. Also, and this especially applies when used among brothers and sisters in the church, but my same concern would be with anybody. It's used to create tribes of us versus them. Often, when used pejoratively, you are woke, therefore I am not woke. Implicitly, I have the moral high ground when I use it that way, and I'm labeling somebody else's approach to things as morally objectionable or inferior. I think that we should be quicker to look within ourselves and notice our own fallenness and brokenness than to identify another person as the other or outside my camp of people. And so just the way it's used with just bolstering tribal identities can often be divisive. And I think that as Christians, we're called to a kind of love and charity that shouldn't be quick to have tribal alignments. And labeling others as woke, I think, is often used to that effect.
Do you have any examples? Bring this down to earth a bit.
There's examples everywhere. It's a huge conversation in culture right now. Like, we read some comments for how people applied it to us. I think it's kind of sad. I suspect that we're largely on the same page with the people who want to criticize us. In evangelicalism right now, I think, what was the publication? Christian Post, I think, this week, and we're recording this in February, did an article writing about some significant disruption that Wheaton College is experiencing, where some alumni have decided that Wheaton is woke and pushing for some change in leadership there. So that's one particular occurrence of Christian against Christian tension along the lines of woke versus anti-woke.
So I find it interesting. I think you're right that putting out the term woke as a critique often accomplishes exactly that, the kind of tribalism or a little sense of moral superiority. But not very long ago, when people started using woke as a form of critique, or when I kind of encountered it as, we'll use woke to critique your position, it was precisely critiquing people for a kind of self-righteousness because, I know what to protest better than you know what to protest.
Yeah.
And so woke was using the term woke to criticize people was originally meant to criticize that kind of self-righteousness and tribalism.
That's an interesting point, because I remember hearing some of this, say 5 years ago, when someone would have some meaningful feedback of maybe an interaction with someone they knew, and it's like, that felt awfully woke, this, that, because they're missing this, and it felt like there was a little more engagement with what was going on, and almost like they were hiding behind, I checked the right box, on the social justice, whatever. And then it became this criticism, and that label kept getting applied to it. And then over the years, it almost feels like that's morphed to the point where I think maybe, I'm not sure if you use this exact word, but almost like a sloppily applied to all kinds of things that we end up disagreeing with. I'm speculating. This is all just things I've kind of seen. I'm like, that's interesting and whatever. And it feels like the term is being more sloppily applied to where now if you're, I don't know, a vegetarian, now you're woke, or you don't use a plastic straw, you're woke, or you're this or that. It just feels like it's used in so many different contexts. Does it have much meaning anymore? Or is it just a word we throw around to people we disagree with? I don't really know. Honestly, I'm really confused, which is maybe why we're having the conversation, because you guys can help me out with this. But do you resonate with that? Like that hastily applied, like, I disagree with you, so hey, you're woke. We don't align or whatever.
Mhm. Yeah, and the way it's used lawfully is definitely functional if we're interested in forming lines of tribal identity or those we disagree with. But I would say there's probably not a appropriate function that we should be seeking out.
So I'd be interested in, can we just list some of the things that woke is intended to catch? You mentioned a few things. I'm thinking of things maybe a little more serious than types of straws. Although,
Well, environmental concern is a serious matter.
Yeah, that would
Mhm.
definitely
Yeah.
be one.
I guess when I hear the term woke used as a kind of a blanket statement, I think they're trying to catch a lot of things under that, things that we might assess in various ways. It does seem to be applied to anybody with some sense of historical guilt or something. You feel guilty because of what your ancestors did. That is labeled as woke.
That's one.
If you feel,
yeah,
any kind of sense of kind of responsibility because of your, social position, class, or race, that quickly gets described as woke. One thing was mentioned in the comments. If there's a sense of stretching out victimhood and playing off of being a victim, that gets labeled as woke. If you're in favor of same-sex relationships, that gets labeled as woke. If you want people to freely identify with, whatever gender they want, separate from their biological sex, that's labeled as woke. There's probably a bunch more things that get caught in there, but I don't know. Does that resonate? It's a kind of a large kind of group of things that the term, I think, is intended to catch.
But generally, the observation of unequal distribution of power, or oppressor versus oppressed, powerful versus disenfranchised, noticing those kind of dichotomies, I think, often is a factor in this. So that could apply with gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity.
Right, which is
perhaps
where
a bit broader as well. Wealth.
Anything that seems connected to critical theory, or especially critical race theory, gets put there.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, actually, okay, so interesting you mentioned that, because there was another quote. I have a whole list here, but there was another one where we interviewed the historian John Ruth about how did indigenous lands in Pennsylvania become Mennonite farms, like in Lancaster, and he did this research of the land that he lived on and wrote this book about it. And someone left this comment: just remember also, this stance that this man is taking is a form of critical theory, which is born out of Marxism and pits the oppressors versus the oppressed. So that was, I think you mentioned that. You also did as well, that power dynamic and so forth. This boomer has it so good all his life that the land that his ancestors gave him, that he has no other recourse than to just sell out to his future generations, to calling him a sellout, basically. So that would be one. Marxist DEI categories was in another one of the quotes. I think that comes into some of the frameworks you were describing with the maybe power dynamics, these Marxist frameworks that are being in this, that is being accused, that is being portrayed in these episodes. Which again, I mean, I don't know, it kind of surprised me. Like, it's not really what I saw there, but again, these labels are used in so many different ways. It feels so hard to pin down, I guess. And that's why I'm struggling a little bit with this. I don't know if that maybe just made things more confusing.
Yeah, I mean, that's why. I mean, I agree with you, Jaron. Like, the term is generally unhelpful. At one point, I think the term woke was, it could be helpful. At one point, within my memory, not very long ago, I think the term could be helpful in kind of pointing out, a kind of glib, shallow, political correctness or certain political orientation, a woker than thou because you say the right thing, and kind of poking fun at it. I think it had a use at that point, but at this point, with it being used for that kind of a blanket thing, it's like, I don't know, is the term useful anymore?
Hmm.
And I think it had a use too, in its more original sense of, are you awake? Are you aware of how society functions and not overly naive? And I'm sure there was more dimensions to that, but, that was part of it. And, I think that was useful for people who were using it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any more that you want to add there? Based on maybe even the Marxist, the DEI element is packaged with wokeism or woke, whatever you want to frame that as. Do we want to go down those rabbit holes at all? Do you have anything else you want to add?
I mean, can we do just a very basic, maybe philosophical reflection on, what is a theory? What is critical theory or whatever?
Yeah.
And so on. And if you want to know what critical theory is, find somebody who has studied it extensively. But when we're talking about a theory in this sense, we're talking about, tools to understand the world. It's a set of vocabulary, just like, the theory of gravity gives you tools, gives you equations to describe the world. Basic Newtonian physics gives you tools to describe the world that work pretty well for describing a lot of things. It doesn't describe the world perfectly because, you need quantum mechanics and general relativity and all of that to more fully describe the world. But Newtonian physics was helpful, still is extremely helpful because it describes the world we interact with very well. So let's wrap that around something like, again, critical theory. It's saying here's some concepts, some tools we can use to understand the world. Now, one of the big reasons that Christians become suspicious of that is, well, where are these concepts coming from?
Mm-hmm.
Are these concepts rooted in, other beliefs that are deeply unchristian? And some of them are, but that doesn't mean that everything that somebody is seeing who's using critical theory to describe it, maybe it's not the best way to describe it. Maybe critical theory is not the best tool for describing this. It doesn't mean that the thing they're describing doesn't exist. It just means that maybe there's a better way to describe it. And it doesn't mean that, the term trauma is now not a helpful word for describing things. Or for that matter, that diversity or inclusion are not helpful words for describing things just because they get used in theoretical frameworks that, the framework as a whole might be messed up. But I don't think that means that diversity or equity or inclusion or trauma are words that are somehow no longer helpful or don't help us see things.
I'm curious about something. You're talking about theory in the sense as a framework. I think that most people wouldn't be conscious of a theory that they're operating with, although I do know that some are. I first learned about critical theory in a introductory literary theory class at a university I was at the time. And so I understood it as a literary theory. And so I know that in academic study of literature is something that people are very conscious of. But outside of that context, is that what in what way do people operate with a theory? In what way has it left academia and entered the mainstream? And is it actually has it actually done that?
I don't know how much it has done that.
Yeah.
It has, much like woke and much the same time, CRT, critical race theory, became a way for, again, basically the same set that uses woke as a criticism started using the term, well, that's CRT as a criticism. And there's lots of things that can be labeled CRT that can be criticized. To what extent is the theory operating? I don't think that everybody who's using the word trauma and diversity is, they're operating out of the framework they're certainly not explicitly operating out of an articulated critical theory framework. I mean, I think one of the concerns expressed in the comments is, well, the way they're talking reveals that they are thinking according to that theory. That's the articulation. Again, I am not familiar enough with the details of, forms of critical theory or whatever. When I hear critical theory at a very general level, and I'm thinking more from philosophy than literature, I'm thinking of really a consciousness of, looking below the surface just a little bit. So critical theory likes to look at the statements that we make. We say why we do this. And look at them and say, well, what's the social dynamic there? What's happening there? Take an example a little further in the past. We've got the American founding documents. You got the Declaration of Independence. And you've got famous language like, all men are created equal and so on, and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And then you have a constitution that gets passed where, what is it? A slave is it 2/5 of a person or 3/5 of a person? I forget which way that went in the Constitution, for the sake of determining, how much representation a state gets and counting the population for political purposes. Well, at a kind of very basic level, I think of critical theory as picking up on the difference between here's the stated rhetoric and here's what got into the Constitution about people who were enslaved and how they were actually treated in regards to being equal. And things get obviously a lot more sophisticated than that. And critical theory also gets I think it does get carried away to where you can get into that mode of operating where that kind of suspicion that, what's being said is not real, that suspicion gets carried so far that you have a hard time seeing sincerity anywhere. The hermeneutic of suspicion becomes you have enough suspicion to expose everything to where it seems like there's nothing left. You don't recognize any goodness or take things at face value. And of course, somebody who's actually doing critical theory is probably going to say that I'm caricaturing them, and I probably am. But I think that's what some people are reacting to, and to see critical theory as a bad thing is, oh, well, this is critical theory. This is what deconstructs everything, doesn't accept anything at face value, subverts authority, so on. I don't know. I have somebody who actually studied literary critical theory, which is probably where this originated.
One junior level class. And you were getting to this at the end, but I would have mentioned Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, seen as the Marx, Freud, and Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh, yeah.
Masters of suspicion, often used in literary theory. Again, I don't know how this connects with philosophy, but especially Marx and Nietzsche, seeing things through economic lens or the lens of power. And so when you're reading a text, you notice it says one thing on the surface, but you have the suspicion that if you look underneath, there's something nefarious going on in terms of power hierarchies or economic disparities.
It seems like that makes things much more complex, right? And could almost muddy the waters a bit. Is that true? Or is that just a suspicion that people have of the suspicion or something? You know what I'm saying? Because people, when I talk to them about critical theory or CRT, it seems like that's the counter reaction to it, and then they're reacting off of each other, and it just gets so shrill and out of control. You don't even know what you're looking at anymore. But maybe I'm totally misreading this.
Speaking from my own experience, it can, when one functions that way regularly, it can make me a bit less trusting, more mistrusting than I ideally would be. It can also sap
Hmm.
some of the enjoyment
Hmm.
of engagement, in my case, of art and literature.
Hmm.
If you're always looking under the surface and suspecting that there's something pernicious going on.
Yeah, and so maybe when people throw these labels out as a derogatory thing of like you're woke or critical theory or this or that, it's them reacting to what you just described potentially. Is that perhaps what's going on here? I don't know. Enough of this is so confusing that it's like kind of hard to know where all this even begins.
Like CRT,
Hmm.
especially a year or two ago, I would see yard signs where people say no CRT. And I was never quite sure when in mainstream popular conversations, when terms are used like that, I'm not exactly sure what it does or does not have to do with the way the term is used academically. I haven't sorted that out.
Well, I mean, yeah, because now another one that's really, at least, again, this is my own personal experience, that I'm seeing hit the mainstream a lot more and it's becoming more derogatory is DEI. Like, I remember not that long ago, that was just kind of whatever. It wasn't necessarily used derogatorily, but now it feels like I'm seeing that a lot more. Oh, that's DEI. Like, so diversity, equity, and inclusion for what those letters stand for. And now it's being used as like, this is really negative thing. And it suddenly, it feels like the conversation is getting very confusing because that term is being thrown around for so many different things. It's like, whoa, I'm not really sure what we're talking about. Well, I mean, it was in one of the comments here. Someone's claiming, oh, this is a Marxist DEI categories that are being used. I'm like, okay, I'm not quite sure what they're talking about because I don't even know what those letters mean anymore. That's just I guess more of a present day thing that I've noticed. And I'm not quite sure what to do with that, actually.
So yeah, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that was definitely something that was embraced. It was the name of a, universities have an office with that name and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So as a Christian with a Christian sexual ethic, a Christian sense of, our biological sex is something that God gives to us, and we need to make peace with that, and of course acknowledging all complexities that can go with gender identity and so on, but we need to make peace with God created us male and female. Yeah, there were things in there under diversity, equity, and inclusion that are not good, and specifically, a promotion of same-sex relationships as good, pushes to get people to put your pronouns in your email.
Yeah.
This sign of, freely adopting pronouns and so on. And no, I didn't find those helpful. Fortunately, context where I were, that was not something that was enforced. So nobody was coming after me and saying, hey, you need to add the pronouns. I mean, there were, an email might at the beginning of the semester or whatever might encourage it, but it's not like anybody was policing it. That part under DEI was definitely pushing against things that are against the Christian understanding of how God made people. That is very true. But what I'm feeling, where I started to see the DEI, where I started picking up on that as a negative term, it was the implication that, you're hiring people just because you need to meet a quota. You're hiring people that aren't qualified because you need to meet a quota of a certain percentage of women or a certain percentage based on race or ethnicity or whatever. And, the accusation was, this is distorting all kinds of stuff because hiring is happening based on representation and not on qualifications or something like that. So in some ways, that was a continuation or maybe an intensification of the whole fight over affirmative action that goes back,
right.
much further in this country. Like, it's been debated in a lot of ways.
So these are some of the criticisms that people have leveled. And to be fair, it's not just an enormous amount of these comments that we get, but it was enough that, hey, let's talk about it on this podcast.
Yes, and I jump in on that.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Those episodes, the amount of people who just found those very helpful in processing it.
Mhm.
Even like, the trauma-informed churches. So I saw people saying, this is using wrong categories and it's not helpful. But I was also very keenly aware of, a brother who had a difficult journey in life and also did his part to make the journey difficult and so on. And, somebody who's really growing in the Lord.
Mm.
Clear testimony, everything. And, he makes the comment, it's like, this describes what my life is like. Like, you should listen to this so that you know what it's like for me. And so, okay. Like, this is credibility because I know that this is a person whose life has been turned around and is growing in the Lord. And he's saying, yeah, this is enormously helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is important context because it seems like, back to something I've said before, these terms are thrown around so much, it's kind of hard to know if they mean much anymore. And we're talking about episodes, one on education, that's very politically charged right now, trauma-informed churches, the one on indigenous lands in Pennsylvania becoming Mennonite farms, blah, blah, blah. All of these things, but it wouldn't matter what you said. Someone's probably going to put one of these labels on it just because those are better lightning rods for these types of things. And that's a good point you raised because the one here that had the comment, this is Marxist DEI categories, the person says, it was also the one episode I at least personally had more people reach out to me and say that was so helpful than I think anything we've published, which was really encouraging to me to be like, okay, we got maybe a few comments like that, but it was helpful to a lot of people, and that's encouraging.
And I got similar comments on that episode, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And so as we think about these buzzwords that we've been using in this episode so far, what are ways or maybe examples you all could give of how we as followers of Christ can engage well, respond well to these types of conversations, or in some cases, perhaps accusations? How do we walk this?
So this is not about the accusations, but it's about some of these issues. So like I mentioned that one of the things that gets labeled woke is when it seems like there's a sense of guilt or responsibility for, things your predecessors did a number of years ago or whatever. But, we do have to reckon with the past in some way. And so the one example that I came across recently came from a Lutheran church, the Lutheran World Federation. And, for a little bit of context, Lutherans and Anabaptists emerged in Europe at the same time. Luther was not particularly fond of Anabaptists. There were a lot of things that happened there. Carry that forward, right? We still have Lutherans and Anabaptists. And so in the early 2000s, there was a Lutheran group and a Mennonite group that worked through that history together and produced a joint description of the history. Like, let's state this in a way that we can both say, yeah, this is an accurate description of what happened. And then out of that, the Lutheran World Federation, so representing a number of Lutheran churches, ended up, writing and adopting a statement that was presented, which was a kind of statement of repentance. And, for me as an Anabaptist, well, I didn't know about this. I wasn't involved, with the groups that were in dialogue, but I do find it meaningful. So I'd like to read that statement, if I could, and a little bit from the Mennonite response, or part of the statement. So it was titled, Action on the Legacy of Lutheran Persecution of Anabaptists. And it begins, when Lutherans today realize the history of Lutheran-Anabaptist relationships in the 16th century and beyond, as it is presented in the report of the Lutheran Mennonite International Study Commission, they are filled with a deep sense of regret and pain over the persecution of Anabaptists by Lutheran authorities, and especially over the fact that the Lutheran reformers theologically supported this persecution. Thus, the Lutheran World Federation, a communion of churches, wishes to express publicly its deep regret and sorrow. Trusting in God, who in Jesus Christ was reconciling the world to himself, we ask for forgiveness from God and from our Mennonite sisters and brothers for the harm that our forebears in the 16th century committed to Anabaptists, for forgetting or ignoring this persecution in the intervening centuries, and for all inappropriate, misleading, and hurtful portraits of Anabaptists and Mennonites made by Lutheran authors in both popular and scholarly forms to the present day. We pray that God may grant to our communities a healing of our memories and reconciliation. And it goes on with some commitments. As I think about it, they acknowledged things. They said, this was wrong. We regret it. We're saying something to people who are descendants of these Anabaptists. We want a healing of our memories and reconciliation. I find that meaningful. That strikes me as the kind of thing that could easily be labeled as woke, because, why are they apologizing for what somebody did 400 years ago, and are they dishonoring their past and all of that? And I don't see it that. I see it as a straightforward acknowledgement. And, they didn't say, well, we can't call ourselves Lutherans anymore. And the statement goes on to mention, there are remaining significant differences between men. There are remaining, significant disagreements and so on. But yeah, I found it deeply meaningful, and I think it's just a good example of dealing with that. And then just a little bit, Mennonite World Conference, presented a letter in response, and just a couple snippets from that. Are we worthy to receive your request? We are painfully aware of our own inadequacy. We cannot bring ourselves to this table with heads held high. We can only come bowed down in great humility and in the fear of the Lord. We cannot come to this point and fail to see our own sinfulness. We cannot come to this point without recognizing our own need for God's grace and forgiveness. And they go on to some specific responses. And then a commitment that is striking, and a commitment that I want to adopt personally, and I hope is the way, Anabaptist Perspectives functions. That Mennonite letter said, we commit ourselves to take care that your initiative for reconciliation is known and honored in Anabaptist Mennonite teaching about Lutherans. Because to me, it is profoundly, the apology has an effect. It produces an obligation in me. We talk about Luther and outrageous things he said. And yes, we have remaining theological differences with Lutherans, but the fact that a statement like this was made, it actually, not only is it healing, it creates a sense of responsibility, like, oh, we can't go around talking about, those Lutherans, they persecuted us, without knowing and honoring, the Lutheran World Federation, representing a large group of Lutherans, has said, that was wrong, and we're sorry about that. And that creates an obligation for us. So I bring this in here because, I fear that anti-wokeism, if we can once again make something general, is going to, I fear that attitude, labeling things woke and labeling this kind of consciousness, awareness of these things as woke, is just going to make it harder to do these kinds of, I think, important reconciling work.
So, Jaron, as we think of ways to respond to these types of things as Christians, what would you like to add on this, or examples you would like to give?
Well, first, I think that the exchange that Marlon read to us is very beautiful. And I really appreciate the exhortation to not be intimidated by the labels that may be put upon us when there's a genuine opportunity for reconciliation, truth, and acknowledgement, such as happened in the conversation between the Lutherans and the Mennonites. I think that and I already alluded to this, but I do think that those labels can drive us towards, political or tribal consciousness that the gospel doesn't have place for. So, just my addition would be, let's avoid the tribal identities, the partisanship, and let's follow the way of Jesus and what that calls us to, which in many cases is charity, reconciliation, and forgiveness.
So we've covered a lot of pieces in this podcast, and I'm curious to hear people's feedback on this. But as we wrap this kind of complicated, a bit messy, perhaps confusing topic and bring it down to earth, is there anything you would like to say in closing for this episode, either of you?
I think it's really important that we're not intimidated by labels, and just to recognize we may get labels for various things. Let's be discreet. Let's not be provocative purely for the sake of being provocative. Maybe let's not be provocative unless, we need to get somebody to think about a particular point. But we get labeled, and we need to be aware of that. And we may get labeled from, left or right or top or bottom or whatever the political categories are. And, we can't hide from that. So we may get labeled as homophobic. And if we're labeled as homophobic, simply because we have stood for, sexuality within marriage as one man and one woman, then we can't be scared of that label. Similarly, if it's simply because of speaking about, God's gift of sexuality and, embracing our biological sex, and it's not done in, insensitive or unhelpful ways, but it's, if we're labeled that for standing up for Scripture, we need to accept that. And in the same way, if we're labeled as woke for, how we talk about wrongs done by the United States government, or how we tell history, not just from the winner's perspective, but from the loser's perspective, so to speak. If we're labeled as woke for that, I think we need to accept that. Like, that's work we need to do. And, I think about it, relation, education, curriculum, how do we talk about things? How do we tell the stories of history? And I think if we tell them honestly and in ways that honor God's kingdom, I think we're going to get caught in the anti-woke wave some. I think we have to accept that. Not by provoking it, but we can't be scared of that.
There's a lot to think about in this episode. I just thank both of you for being willing to come on and engage with these questions or comments that we've received from listeners. And I encourage people listening to this, if you have thoughts, feel free to leave us a comment or contact us. But I think you've ended us with an important piece there, Marlon. Follow what Scripture teaches, follow Christ, and don't worry about the labels too much. I think that's some pretty important advice to end and leave with our listeners. So thank you both for sharing. Thanks for listening to this episode of Anabaptist Perspectives. If you found this interesting, you may want to check out the episode we did with Ruth Anna Coons. We referred to it several times throughout this episode, and you can find that linked in the description down below. Thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you in the next episode.